Anchored in Reaching is for curious people who want to explore the story that God is writing in history and who are looking for their own place in that story to find meaning and vibrancy in their life and vocation. I'm Kevin Manoia. Join me each week as we probe the edges of faith and living, always in relation to God who knows you best. For some, it'll be an opportunity to anchor yourself more securely in your faith. For others, it'll be motivation to reach out to engage more broadly. In either case, these conversations should encourage, enlighten, and challenge you. Welcome back, everybody, to Anchored in Reaching, the podcast where we want to stretch your thinking and fuel your curiosity, particularly about your faith, about the church. And in this session and in this episode, we're in the middle of a series called The Diversity of Unity. That means that unity can only be found where we recognize and embrace the diversity that's inherent within our faith, that's inherent within the church, and we don't begin to compartmentalize and shrink God's kingdom into our own little bubble that we can control and determine. So we're exploring a lot of different features here to discover this unity. And I want to remind you that you can check out any notes in the show notes. And also, I hope that you'll listen to it, download, and then share very broadly, because we're talking to some really wonderful people in this series. You remember that we did an introduction to kind of compare the diversity of the church with the vascular system of the human body, and we talked about that diversity. We're talking to different people, and today I've got the great privilege of having a dear friend, the Reverend John Cager, who is the district elder of the North Kansas district of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, that's a mouthful. And I have a hunch that there are some people who don't know what that is. And you kind of put these terms together. Probably the most confusing is the Episcopal side, but we don't need to talk about that. But I'm really glad to have you here, John. It's great to be able to talk with you. And today we want to explore particularly this idea of the Black church, because the AME church is predominantly Black. So welcome, John. Glad you could join us.
I'm happy to be here with you, Kevin.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you. And because I know that I'm going to learn something. You know, whenever I talk to Reverend Cager, he's got such insight and such experience, having pastored churches in Los Angeles and throughout a long career of raising up leaders. So let me just ask you, John, district elder of the AME Church, just briefly, tell us a little bit, what is that?
So I am the presiding elder of the Midwest North District in the AME Church.
My apologies.
No problem. Just for clarity's sake, myself and one of my colleagues, we are the bishop's representative over our 42 churches in the middle part of the country: Western Missouri, Eastern Kansas, parts of Nebraska, and my job with the 21 churches that I supervise is to make sure that the pastors have what they need in terms of information, guidance, and leadership to lead their individual congregations. I am kind of the middle manager between our bishop and our pastors. One of my favorite parts of the job is that I also get to mentor and develop and encourage new pastors and people who are starting their ministry careers.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know better than to call you a district elder. I don't know why it came out of my mouth. You are a presiding elder.
It was a district elder for 100 years. We changed the names every so often.
So I guess I'm just caught in the past, right? I got to get with the times here.
Everybody who was a Methodist knew what you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And those who aren't Methodists are probably still trying to figure out what I'm talking about. Right. Presiding elder, yeah, that's great, because there is this structure, the Episcopal structure, and you are. I like the reference. I've often used that reference as well, kind of middle management. And I happen to believe that those are the people, those are the leaders that are pretty influential in the life of denominations, perhaps more in some ways than some of the senior leaders. But anyway, the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, is largely a Black denomination, came out of the 19th century, right? And And yet, it's preserved its identity as a Black denomination. What are some of the features that caused that to happen? I mean, we can all imagine what, but describe it to us. How did the AME Church really come to exist?
Very quickly, the AME Church started as an offshoot of the ME Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, in the 1790s. Richard Allen and a group of freed blacks as well as African slaves went to St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia for worship. The worship area was segregated, the blacks up in the balcony, the white people on the main floor. The black people arrived during the time of prayer, and so not to be disrespectful, they knelt in the aisles before they got to the balcony to pray. The ushers came to dislodge them during the act of prayer because they weren't in the right spots. And the famous words were uttered by Richard Allen, our founder: "If you will allow us to continue our prayer, we will leave and trouble you no more." From
Wow.
there, they left St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, they pulled their resources together, bought a blacksmith shop, started the first black church, black denomination, meaning predominantly free blacks and African slaves in Philadelphia. They remained in association with the Methodist Episcopal Church for almost 20 years, and in 1816, they incorporated as the first black incorporated denomination in the United States. Our motto is, we were founded by Africans, but not for Africans. We're proud that we have churches on 5 continents, including the Indian subcontinent, where we have 150 churches, and most of those members are Asians and not of African descent.
Very interesting. Wow. And there are a lot of denominations that actually came out of the ME, or the Methodist Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. I mean, my own denomination included. The Free Methodist Church came out of the ME Church, and various other denominations did as well. And so we have that common Wesleyan theological background, that Methodist structure, and so forth and so on. But let's do a quick fast forward, because what I'm really curious about here is, as we live 120, 130, 40 years later now, we still have these streams of the church and these groupings of the church. And the AME Church is largely a black denomination. And in some cases, everybody talks about, quote unquote, the black church. Well, I mean, what does that mean, and why is it designated that way? We don't often talk about, quote unquote, the white church, unless maybe that happens in the black churches. They talk about the white church, and maybe that's the way it is. I don't know. We don't talk about the South American church. We don't talk about the Asian church. We talk about the church, but there's a particular uniqueness about the black church. And then in a minute, I'm really curious to know about the cultural influences that has on its understanding as the church.
Well, the reason we call it the black church is just to differentiate it. Like we discussed in the founding of my denomination, there was segregation involved. The reason there is a black church and non-black churches, and yes, in the black church context, we do talk about the white church. The reason we have that separation is because of racial segregation. Black people worshiped with black people, often because they were not allowed to worship with white people, or if they were allowed to worship with white people, it was in inferior situations. And so black people worshiped where they could, and often it was with each other. We could go on for hours just about the history of the black church in America and its foundations in slavery. But the bottom line is, people tend to stick with their tribes. People tend to stick with their groups. We have black neighborhoods, we have non-black neighborhoods, we have Latinx churches, we have Latinx neighborhoods, we have Asian churches, we have Asian neighborhoods. I think the largest single church in Los Angeles County is actually Young Nok Korean Presbyterian Church, which has something like 500,000 members only because they have, a number of different churches under that one organization, one umbrella. But the reality is all of our churches are expressions of the cultures of the members. And most of our cultural divisions are also racial divisions. And so we have a black church, like we do have churches of other denominations. And yes, like I said, we refer to the majority culture as white church in the black church.
Yeah. Well, you used a phrase that I think I want to pick up on, that our worship is usually a reflection of our culture. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of people who may kind of see the black church as a cultural church. In other words, they can get away with it because that's their culture, so to speak. And, or they might say, at least some white people will say, well, you need to go get a black church experience, or this was a particularly active service, or rowdy, or whatever they want to call it, as a lot like the black church. And there's this cultural freight that's attached to the black church. I mean, is that coming out of a black culture, or is that somehow theologically and spiritually written into how the AME Church and other black churches may worship?
Well, there is no monolithic black church, like there is no monolithic Judaism or monolithic Free Methodism. However, and you will love this as considering one of your former offices, what a lot of people look at as the, quote, black church, unquote, you see the scene from the Blues Brothers where the people are jumping and shouting and folks on trampolines and whatnot. That comes out of a movement you're familiar with that happened about 150 years ago called the Holiness Movement. And Holiness Movement, as you know, the Holiness Movement was an outgrowth of Methodism.
Yes.
Where people sought to have a different and a more spiritual relationship with God. Well, that really spoke to black people and white people, primarily in the South and in the West. As the Holiness Movement grew, you had a couple of outgrowths. I was not raised Methodist or Pentecostal. I was raised Baptist, but I was raised Baptist in a tradition by my grandfather, who was the pastor of the St. John Baptist Church in Hickory Flat, Louisiana. Later on, he moved to Cleveland, as a lot of folks from the South, black folks from the South, migrated north in the teens and the 1920s. He did as well, but when he migrated from the South, he brought that Southern holiness tradition with him. And the holiness tradition was one where, as people sought to be more spiritual, you really defined holiness in those days by what you couldn't do. Mm-hmm. You couldn't dance, you couldn't drink, you couldn't go out, you couldn't associate with the world. Some interpretations, you couldn't vote and participate in many of the aspects of normal society. But the one thing you could do was go to church. Yeah. And so in the black community, because we also had so many other things that we couldn't do because we were limited by race, the one thing we did was go to church, and we went to church all day. Some of my uncles who grew up in the 20s and 30s, if the choice was going to church all day or staying home and chopping wood or picking cotton, they opted to go to church.
Good choice.
Yeah. Part of that also in that holiness tradition was church in the black tradition also became not just a place where you expressed worship, but it's where you experienced self-actualization and an acknowledgement of who you were. The late Reverend Dr. Foster Craggett tells the story. He got his doctorate, I believe, from Union Seminary Crozier in the late 30s, early 40s. It's called to pastor church in Indiana in the state of Indiana in the 40s. He goes to the small town where the church is. In the church, he is Dr. Craggett with a PhD from this great seminary. But downtown in the city, he was boy. And for many of our black people who come out of that era, the church was the place where they could be Mr. and Mrs. because in the mainstream society, they were boy or they were girl or they were auntie or they were a nanny or a maid. The story is told out of my own family tradition. We had a family member who was a Pullman porter. He walked to work or caught public transportation to get to the train yard when he was working, But because he was a porter and he made great tips on Sundays, he drove a Cadillac to church. Now, he couldn't drive it to work because he couldn't let the white folks know how much money he was making. But at the church, he could be Mr. So-and-so.
Yeah.
People often bring up the expression of, at Black churches, we still pretty much like to dress up.
Yep.
One of the reasons our people like to dress up, particularly those in the generation before ours, Kevin, my parents, grandparents, church was the place they could dress up. Mm-hmm. And show off their finery.
Yeah.
Moving on, as a place of self-actualization, I mentioned my grandfather coming up from St. John Baptist Church in Hickory Flats. In Hickory Flat, my grandfather was a graduate of Tuskegee. So not only was he the pastor of St. John Baptist Church, he was the postmaster for Hickory Flat. He was the superintendent of schools for Hickory Flat. He owned the only store, the general store in Hickory Flat. Now, because Hickory Flat was an all-black segregated place, St. John Baptist Church was also where the post office was. St. John Baptist Church was also where the school was housed. Yeah. And so for Black people, the church was not just a place of worship. It was the place where you came for education. It was the place where you came for communication. When he moved to Cleveland, Ohio, he was not the only one to come from rural Louisiana. Those other folks who came, whether it was for job opportunities or whatever, when they come up north, the one thing they are looking for is acceptance. And the one place they could count on for acceptance was the Black church.
Yeah. So this is really, really helpful. I wish, and maybe we need to talk about this another time in another episode too, because that shift of the church is where a person is self-actualized suddenly shifts the role of the church to the place where you celebrate, where you dress up, where you feel the best about yourself. Everything the church ought to do, it does in a community that may be ostracized or oppressed outside of the walls of the church. Now the church becomes that release, that place where they find the fullness of who they are, that self-actualization that you talk about, which probably is not nearly as prevalent in the white churches because it's, on a percentage basis, it's really hard to go into a Black church and not feel like there's life there. I mean, the celebration, the dress, the way people carry themselves, the positivity. You can go to a lot of white churches and feel like, this place is dead as doornails, right? And so that shift of the role of the church, I think, is a really important one. And maybe that's where we assume, or where we get the perception that the Black church is much more celebratory because they're expressing this, I know who I am. And then you mentioned the integration. It's the place where the school was, the postmaster was. So this integration of Christian faith with all dimensions of life. I mean, it really is an integrated perception, right?
Absolutely. And it's an integration of necessity, but also we have an understanding that the Black church had to be different from the white church, because white people had a variety of institutions. The only institution that Black folks, particularly 100, 150 years ago, even 50 years ago, the only consistent institution that Black folks had for them was the church. And so very often the church was all encompassing. And in fact, as we see the evolution of churches, all churches or most churches are seeing lower levels of participation of people, I think, across the board in almost every demographic except for maybe the Latinx ones. In the Black church now, we have a conversation going on. Well, why isn't church as important to our children and grandchildren as it was to our parents and grandparents? And I contend that one of those reasons, a big part of those reasons, is because our children and grandchildren have many more outlets than our parents and our grandchildren did. When we talk about self-actualization, Black preachers now talk about when they have a very important sermon that they're going to make their Easter speech. Well, that's a joke in the Black community, because almost every Black person who is a Christian who's over 60 remembers that the one place where you had to learn how to speak in public was in church, because your grandmother and your grandfather were counting on you to be able to speak properly in church on Easter Sunday or Christmas or at the Sunday school program.
Mm-hmm.
For many Black people, they would do that's where they got their start in public speaking, at the church program.
Yeah,
you know,
and singing.
And singing, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's, I have to admit that, when I go to, when you go to a Black church, I see more hats, women wearing hats. Mm-hmm. I love it. Mm-hmm. Men wearing suits, dressed up, and now I'm old. I guess I'm old school. This kind of dates me, but I kind of like that. It's kind of bringing your best to the Lord, and I think that's probably the expression that you're talking about. I also noticed that whether it's a Pentecostal Black church or a more mainline Black church, which I would consider the AME more mainline and mainstream in the church world, there's always a lot of vibrancy and always a lot of loud singing, clapping, and just really, what's the word? Getting down, or I don't know what you call it.
We call it getting in the spirit.
Getting in the spirit, yeah. So like people would assume that the AME church is going to be pretty staid. It's not. I mean, the AME churches I've preached in, I love preaching because it brings the best out, right?
Historically, the draw for Methodism, for African Methodism, and at one point we were the largest Black denomination in the world 100 years ago. The draw for Black Methodism was that we were lively.
Yeah.
Because there are some even today, there are some Black Nazarene and Baptist congregations that are many Black people of my generation, and certainly of my parents' generation, can tell you the arguments and the fights that went on 40, 50 years ago when they decided to bring drums and guitars into churches. The draw to the AME church was we were a little more liberal in that area, and we'd had lively worship. Well, in 1906, in the barn of what was First AME Church, there was a happening called the Azusa Street Revival.
Yeah.
Out of which we had the launching of the Church of God in Christ and the Assemblies of God and Pentecostal Assemblies of the World. Yeah. And the Pentecostals kind of took our liveliness to another order of magnitude.
Yeah.
And so when you see the liveliness and the celebration levels that came out of the Azusa Street Revival, two things happened. A, Pentecostalism, white and Black, took off around the country. B, for those who didn't embrace all of the tenets of Pentecostalism, particularly the speaking in tongues and some of the spiritual gift stuff, they did imitate the worship style of the Pentecostals. One of the first Black radio preachers came out of Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s, and he was traditional Baptist, but very high-spirited worship, high-spirited preaching. And I just, because I know we're running out of time, you're going to have to do an examination of holiness, the holiness to Pentecostal through line.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, we talk about the celebration of the Black church. Pull up a YouTube of one of R.W. Schambach's camp meetings. And look at a video of a Black church worship service in the same time, 70s, early 80s. You're not going to see much difference in terms of theology, hermeneutic, or homiletic. I happen to think that the singing may be better in the Black church or the dancing, but you're going to see that same energy and fervor that comes out of that holiness and Pentecostal movement.
Yeah, well, what you're doing is I see that you seem to be mixing two features that cause the vibrancy, and I know, in just a couple of minutes. So, is the liveliness that you alluded to in the Black church, is it a function of the spirit and the lively spirit, and even in the Pentecostal Black church, is it the spiritual gifts and all of that? Or to what extent does it come from a natural cultural celebration of the place we can go to really self-actualize ourselves and celebrate that?
Let's look at three things. Let's look at the celebration as a function of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
That's certainly what Pentecostals will say. That celebratory moment is led by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit really fell that day, is what they will say when the Spirit runs high. As an expression of African culture, the wardens at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in the 1790s said the Africans were too loud. They were shouting during their prayers and making these verbal expressions that were not seemly to the white folks. The third piece, and this is my observation, but it's shared by some actual scholars and theologians, there's a cathartic element to the Black church expression of worship, because again, you're repressed Monday through Saturday, particularly in the era of my grandparents, great-grandparents. My great-grandmother was a slave. For her, going to church was where she could let it all out.
Yes.
Because when she was cleaning someone's house or doing chores for someone else, she had to remain in this box. But she could be her authentic self in front of her God on Sunday at that little Baptist church in Hickory Flat.
Yeah, man, that is a powerful statement and a powerful image, John. I guess I would hope, and I know you share this, I would hope that, first of all, we not see bondage in racial terms, but we recognize the bondage we all live under, and that we see the church as the place where we can let it all out and discover the freedom and the actualization of who we are in the freedom that comes in Christ. Whether we're white, black, whether we're Asian, whether we're Latino, whatever it is we are, oppression does not discriminate. We all live with this oppression. In the Black community, clearly it was very, very political and very physical and very ethnic driven and very racially driven. And so this is a wonderful example of what I think the church ought to be, is the place where we can go to self-express and, as you say, let it out and let God receive us and make us who he wants us to be. I hope I haven't forced an image or a message on it, but your images, what you're talking about here is just very, very interesting and very motivating as far as what the role of the church ought to be in welcoming people to become who they've really been created to be.
I would just say, as one who trains young pastors, one of the criticisms of the current Black church is that it has gotten away from the areas of self-actualizing and empowering people. In Orange County right now, the largest Black congregation is Saddleback. North of the 101 freeway in Los Angeles County, the largest Black congregation used to be Church on the Way. I think now it may be Shepherd of the Hills. But I think one of the issues we're seeing in the Black church now is churches that have just limited themselves to being places where people can shout. The younger generations they want more than that.
Yeah.
And so when I counsel Black pastors now, one of the things I'm with them is, the church has to continue to serve the people at their level of need. Yes, they need that cathartic shout, but my grandfather built his church by teaching people how to read.
Yeah.
Our churches need to empower, our Black churches need to be empowering people.
Well, that's a good lesson to young pastors. And that's also why I'm glad you're in front of young pastors and you're teaching and you're mentoring and you're shaping and you're leading and guiding them. So, John, what a joy to have you. Thank you so much for taking time to talk. I know we could go on and talk about a whole bunch of other stuff, but maybe sometime in the future we'll pick this up. But I'm grateful for your time. Thanks so much for joining me.
I appreciate the invitation, and please make sure I get the link so I can send it to the folks who need to hear it.
You betcha. Yeah. Well, and thanks, folks, for tuning in. Stay with us in this series. This is hopefully very insightful for you, and hopefully you've been able to take some notes about the nature of the church, My greatest desire for you is that you will begin to see the church with all of its diversity and not see that as a threat, not see that as competition, but to see that as exactly how God intended the church to be. Diverse in many, many ways, and yet in that diversity, we have a unity and a bond that cannot be broken that's centered in the person of Jesus Christ, our cornerstone. So thanks for taking time. Continue to stick with us. Look forward to having you join us next week for the next episode in this series on the diversity of unity. God bless you. Let me encourage you to keep leaning into the wonderful adventure of becoming all that God has envisioned for you to be. Anchoring yourself in a secure identity, you reach with confidence to engage with people and daily life all around you. Allow your curiosity to explore and find God in the edges. Please take time to share this podcast with all your friends and invite them to join me in upcoming weeks as we explore together this exhilarating journey of being anchored and reaching.